It's awesome to be here. I've known a lot of the guys and girls at Skookum for a really long time, and it's an awesome company here in Charlotte. I'm super proud to know a lot of the all the best technologists I know somehow interact with Skookum or end up there. So it's always been great to work with you guys and be a part of what you're doing. So today, like the title said, as advertised, we're gonna be talking about Amazon's culture of innovation. Right. So I worked in the financial services industry for about 8 years before I came to Amazon 4 years ago. And I've always been kind of like a student and very interested in how organizations structure themselves and their culture and their leadership principles and mission statements and things. I think when I came to Amazon, especially from financial services, I was super interested to figure out what is Amazon doing so seemingly different from the outside that's allowing them to innovate in just a bunch of different areas in business and in technology, right? I think it's not a hard stretch of the imagination to see all the things that Amazon's done coming from financial services, where it feels like doing really big things is super hard, and the industry just felt to me like it moved slower in some areas. So I wanted to be a student of what Amazon was doing and learn from it. So I'm super excited that Amazon lets me get to talk to you guys about that. I'm super excited to be able to hear your questions. And then, if you want to talk to me either after or over email or LinkedIn, always love carrying on the conversation as much as I can. So with that, I'll get started. This is going to talk about kind of the way Amazon organizes itself for innovation. We always like to say that there is no right way to do this. There's no best way to do this. And we don't prepare that our way is the way to do it. It's just the way that works for us, right? So there might be things in here that would or wouldn't work for your company. And, you're going to be the best judge of that or your industry. But just love talking about how it works for us. And, if there's something you can take away from it, then that's awesome. So with that, we'll get into it. So, our mission, as many of you have probably seen, right, to be Earth's most customer-centric company, it's super broad, right? But what it means is it doesn't restrict us to a specific domain, market, technology, or offering, right? We're essentially defined by the aim of trying to solve customer problems and pain points, really, across all industries and domains. Doesn't say anything about selling books, right? Like what Amazon initially started off with. It doesn't say anything about, just selling services hosted out of a data center, right? Which is what AWS started off with. I'll also say too, while the mission is broad, it's also specific in how it helps us make decisions, right? By keeping customer at the center of all the decisions that we make. What we like to call customer obsession, and you'll hear me say customer obsession a bunch. It really helps you, keep your focus on what you're working on. And it's often a tiebreaker, right? Like we'll be in a conversation about what the right thing to do is. And it also almost always comes down to what's the most customer obsessed thing we can do in this situation, right? So it's a really great kind of guiding mission principle. And it really drives a lot of what we do. So it also influences how we start our innovation process, right? So we dive deep to understand customers, what they need or want, where they have frustration or pain points in different processes and in their life. And then we work backwards from there, right? Many companies often start from a competitor focus or a technology focus, and then they build something and then kind of toss it over the wall to the marketing department and say, hey, we built this thing, go find a market for it, right? And at Amazon, we like to kind of do it the inverse, right? So let's deeply understand what our customers going through, and then let's work backwards from what our vision is for solving that problem and figure out the competencies, the technologies, the tools that we need in order to solve that, right? And I think that's a really powerful thing about Amazon. And it's almost I'd say, changed my perspective on how businesses can serve their industries and what products and services they can offer, right? I think it's very easy for companies to say, we do this one thing because this is what we're good at, right? And at Amazon, we don't say that. We say, this is the customer problem that we're trying to solve, and we'll figure out how to hire the right people or build the right technology in order to make that come to fruition, right? It's a really, really powerful way of looking at things. There's also another great benefit of being customer oriented in your innovation process and how you center your company. And one of the great benefits is that, customers are never happy or satisfied, or at least they won't tell you that they're not satisfied, but you'll be able to see it in the context of their situation and their problem, right? So even when we deliver something that really delights them initially, over time, customers are constantly asking for more, right? And I think a simple example that we all know is, Amazon Prime, right? In the beginning, it was free shipping, which seemed awesome, right? And then free shipping kind of becomes standard, and we went to 2-day shipping, right? 2-day shipping now seems standard, and we're going to 1-day and same-day shipping, right? So it helps us not rest on our laurels, because we're constantly orienting ourselves to what the expectations and the problems of our customer are, and how we can create new and unique offerings to solve those pain points. So there's always room for innovation when you're oriented around the customer. So history of Amazon, everybody is probably deeply familiar with a bunch of the stuff on this page. The one kind of innovation most recently that I've really enjoyed, especially kind of outside of AWS, is the Amazon Go stores. So they're not super widely rolled out yet, but for cities that have them, if you've ever been to one, you just download an app on your phone. When you go into the Amazon Go store, which is about the size of a convenience store, you scan your app at the front of the store. You walk in, pick up whatever you want, and then just walk out. There's no checkout lines, nothing. And it's really, really cool. And in about a minute or two after you leave, you get a notification on your phone with a receipt of the things that you just walked out with, right? So, this is a physical store solution, right? So Amazon, obviously, initially we served customers over the internet and through the mail, right? And then we started to branch out into physical solutions like this with unique technology and solutions in order to solve customer pain points. And that's really, I think, an interesting way to look at how we drive innovation within our company is we aren't constrained to just doing things the same way that we've always done them, right? Which is shipping to customers and not having physical locations. But when we do something, we want it to be different and unique and to solve a customer pain point that currently exists, right? And I think the Amazon Go store is a great example of us offering a physical convenience store that offers, the same food and snacks that you can get in, say, a 7-Eleven, but with a significantly different experience when it comes to being able to pop in and pop out. An example I give people is I was waiting on an Uber one time outside of Amazon's headquarters, and there's an Amazon Go store right there. And so the Uber was going to get there in 2 minutes, and there was an Amazon Go store. So I just quickly walked in, grabbed a soda, and walked out, and then hopped in the Uber, right? Something I couldn't have done if I was going to have to wait in line. So, there's all of these innovations that we've been able to work through since the beginning, and it comes from focusing on customer pain points. So we're going to talk about 4 main pillars around how Amazon organizes for innovation. You'll see as we progress through these that some of them are overlapping and some of them are independent. But we've really found that all 4 of these pillars are super important to us. There isn't one that's more important than the other. I definitely think there's companies out there that can take 1 or 2 things away and integrate it to the way that you do things. So like I said at the very beginning, don't try to pretend that this is the way that everybody should do it. But I hope that you can find things in here that makes sense for you. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the people part of innovation, right? So people, definitely the most important. As much as we love technology and the things that it brings us, people are the ones that are going to be creating that. And anybody in a services company can understand this really clearly, right? So what drives the consistency at which we're able to innovate, and what people processes do we have that allows that to be done over time? By far, what I consider Amazon's secret sauce, which isn't all that secret, is our 14 leadership principles, right? So the 14 leadership principles of Amazon, they're public. You can Google them. and they're on our HR website, are really like the foundations of how we organize and we lead as people. So each Amazon employee is a leader, right? A leader is not somebody that manages people. People managers are also leaders, but any Amazon employee is expected to be a leader and to follow the leadership principles. The key with the leadership principles is that they apply differently in different situations. For example, I've recently started hiring a team within Amazon. So the leadership principle you see on here, hire and develop the best, that's super critical leadership principle for me personally right now. And the way Amazon reinforces these leadership principles is by integrating them into how we handle almost everything in kind of like our weekly schedule. So when we're in meetings with our team, we talk about the leadership principles over email. When we're discussing potential projects, we use leadership principles. When we're hiring and doing performance reviews, we're hiring against the leadership principles, right? If you ever do an interview at Amazon, the person that's interviewing you most likely has leadership principles that they're asking you questions based on. And when I talk to my employees and when my boss talks to me at the end of the year, they're going to be comparing me to how I use the Amazon leadership principles in my role. So it's really powerful how these aren't just like things that go on a poster and look great. They're really practiced actively within the company. And I think that's super important, that if you're going to try to drive culture, it can't just be something that is talked about once a year at like a kickoff meeting. It has to be something that's really ingrained into the DNA of the company, right? And this definitely it starts top down, right? Like the leaders and the executives within your company have to reinforce these leadership principles and conversations and processes with their managers. And then, it has to go all the way down from the senior executives of the company and then be ingrained in processes, right? If we didn't have the leadership principles as part of our hiring process and performance process, and if managers didn't integrate it into the conversations they have with their employees on a daily or weekly basis, it'd be super easy for them to kind of just fade away and be on posters. So extremely important for the way that we drive innovation. And then, the saying at the bottom is awesome, unless you know better ones. And we say this a lot, right? Like, hey, here's what you should do unless you know better, right? Which is a reflection on us expecting our people to have high judgment, right? Like we hire adults that have great judgment. We expect you to focus on your customer. And in some cases, if you focus on your customer, you find out there's things that are important that aren't on this list, then use your best judgment and operate in the best interest of your customer. Another one of our leadership principles is invent and simplify, right? Which I think is pretty key for the innovation topic. And part of that says, as we do new things, we accept that we'll be misunderstood for long periods of time. And that's actually a really important principle when you're talking about innovation at a firm, right? Because for anything of meaningful size, when it comes to innovation, in the beginning, it might not appear as if progress is being made quickly or clearly. And you really have to have the vision and patience in order to be able to stick to innovation over a long period of time. There's a bunch of examples of this at Amazon. One of the well-known ones is Kindle, right? So we were essentially a bookstore that released a electronic device that was super clunky. It actually weighed more than a normal book. It was new in a lot of different ways. And we were criticized at the time because people said, you're going to cannibalize your book sales by releasing an electronic device where people can order books often cheaper than they would by going to your website and ordering it online, right? But we had a vision. We had a vision that over time, customers would benefit from the ability to be able to get any book they wanted, any book in the world, within 60 seconds. And that was the vision of Kindle. So we released the first version of Kindle and then just kept iterating, right? So as we got feedback from customers, as we got to observe Kindle kind of as an experiment. And most things at Amazon start as experiments, some very costly experiments, but still experiments. We got to see really clearly like what types of demands customer had for this device. And many years later, Kindle's been a huge success and is for many people like their go-to way that they read books, right? So it's been a great success, but we had to be patient and we had to be willing to be misunderstood for a long time, sometimes internally within the company. There's a great story of our retail CEO, Jeff Wilke, disagreeing with Jeff Bezos on whether we should even get into this business, right? Because we were a bookseller and Jeff Bezos wanted to get into building hardware devices. We have another leadership principle called have backbone, disagree, and commit. So Jeff Wilke had backbone to go to the CEO Jeff Bezos and tell him that he disagreed with this, but then at the end of the day, he committed to working on the experiment, and willing to be wrong. And in the end, he was very happily wrong.
Hey, Andrew, quick question.
Yeah,
from Q&A. So talking about, and you just hit on it, the backbone piece. What were some of the things that kept that team focused and staying on that line to continue down this, knowing that there were folks that were anti or against? You're always going to get those snipers in innovation, right? So what is it that kept them along? I saw the principle that probably helped it, but what else really from a culture standpoint helped people just push past that?
Yeah. So I'll talk about it a little bit later, but one of the things that we do is when we have a new idea or experiment, we spin up a new team for it, right? So, and that doesn't always mean hiring net new employees. It might mean taking employees from current projects and putting them on an assignment. But we try to not have dependencies with other teams that might be disincentivized to help you, right? So you can imagine if you're responsible for the Amazon book business and there's a team sitting next to you that's working on the Kindle, that you might not be as incentivized to help them do their work, right? Because in some cases, their success is going to eat into your individual success, right? So we definitely try to remove any sort of dependencies between teams when we can and allow them to operate independently. And if that requires hiring new skill sets, we had to start hardware from scratch, right? So we had to build all new teams, processes, and people in order to get that done. And then for very large bets, like Kindle in particular, you have to have the executive team has to be willing to be patient, right? It's that something like Kindle couldn't have happened if it was just a vision that was adopted by one employee, right? This had to be something, especially at the size of Amazon back then, that was embraced by the executive leadership. Not all bets have to be that big. And in fact, I think the scale of the bet and the experiment that you're doing, especially at Amazon, kind of governs where you need to get buy-in from. I tell people on my team all the time to go experiment with customers on building things for AWS, right? That experiment doesn't need buy-in from anybody above me because it's worthwhile. It's not a huge upfront investment of time and money, and we can always correct it in the future. But for example, if I wanted to build a brand new AWS service, then that would require a much more significant investment and willingness to be patient from leaders above me, frankly, with the budget and the capacity to invest in it. So I think those are some of the things that we do in order to make sure that people get the space in order to really stick with it.
Hey, Andrew, to that same point, you're kind of touching on a couple different things here around, well, I'm glad you're starting with culture because it's incredibly important, but the kind of the dynamic between top-down leadership towards innovation and then versus grassroots uprising of innovation. And can you just talk a bit about the dynamic between there, a little bit more between at Amazon between those two? Is there a chicken and egg component for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point. At Amazon, innovation isn't a team. We definitely have portions of the company that are focused more on research, scientific research, but almost always scientific R&D and innovation activities happen within your standard teams, right? So at Amazon, we expect everybody to be innovating and think big is one of our leadership principles. And actually, everything about Amazon incentives wise actually reinforces this, right? So if you want to get promoted at Amazon, people are looking for examples of think big. They're looking for examples of where you had bigger impact. So, it's very much a distributed innovation culture versus a singular, innovations happening in one team. We don't have teams that are expected to just like carry on with business as usual while the other people get to have all the fun, right? And I'll explain this a little bit later in the way that we organize our teams, but we call it like innovation on the edge, right? It's a distributed model, not a single model. And while certainly there are innovation ideas that come from the top, like the Kindle idea was something where obviously Mr. Bezos was driving that himself. There's thousands and thousands of experiments that happen at Amazon every day that Mr. Bezos and certainly like the executives under him don't have any idea about, and they're fine not having an idea about them, right? There's things that my team's doing that my manager doesn't know about because they're small experiments, and we'll try something, and if it doesn't work, we'll keep iterating. And then when there's a success, then it's time to double down, and maybe you do have to go find more people. So I think it's all about distributing that, especially at a company of significant size. The way that we're able to run in so many different industries at such efficiency and scale is because we distribute ownership for innovation all the way across the organization. And many of the ideas, our best ideas at Amazon, often don't come from the top. They come from, engineers or business owners, much further down the organizational chain. So the next example of, kind of long-term thinking, willingness to be misunderstood was, AWS, right? In the beginning, AWS was misunderstood by certainly enterprise technology world. Wall Street wasn't super happy about it. And it's turned out to be really, really great for the industry and for the company. We had a vision that this was going to be something that was really going to change the customer experience of using enterprise IT. And in the first couple of years, there's definitely a lot of criticism from the outside, but based on the feedback we were getting from customers and the data that we were receiving and the growth that we saw in our experiments, we were super confident that over the long term, this was going to be a great investment for Amazon and something great for our customers. So I think that's another kind of point to your question is how do you stay the course in those early days? I think you just have to be like really ruthless about the data and the customer perspectives that you're receiving, right? And there's times at AWS where we release a new service and we receive feedback from customers that they see value in what we're doing, but we're not hitting the mark, right? And so we actually will rewrite entire AWS services after we've released them in order to refine the way the service is offering value to the customers. So you definitely have to have a management team though that's invested long-term in the vision for large investments like that. So this is one of my favorite, I say this to my team all the time. I love it. And it's probably just because of some personal characteristics I have, but be stubborn on the vision, but flexible on the details, right? So innovation is super hard, right? And up front, you can't always know everything that you need to build or do or the exact right path in order to get to the vision that you have for your customer. And at Amazon, that's okay. Like we're willing to not know every single technical detail and implementation detail up front. But we'll stay stubborn on the vision, right? And I think the Kindle example is a great example. AWS is a great example. I think in the beginning of AWS, there's no way we could have projected where the industry has gone and all the services that we have today. 175 services. There's no way in the beginning you could have predicted that. But the vision of delivering IT services, in a scalable fashion over the internet, pay-as-you-go pricing, like that's a vision that we've been stubborn on, and the customer experience is something we've been stubborn on, but super flexible on how exactly we get there. And I think that helps that iterative mindset. Then one more thing here on culture, right? So bias for action is a leadership principle that we have. So speed, we have conviction that speed really matters in business, right? I know this is universally accepted that speed is positive, but also Also, I see in some industries that your behaviors don't always reinforce that speed is important. So we feel that speed is important. And so we have this concept of one and two-way doors. And one-way door decisions are decisions that are typically irreversible, right? And they require huge amounts of upfront commitment. And we need to do a ton of analysis before we make a commitment like that. An example would be a new AWS data center or new Amazon.com fulfillment center. Those are large, many millions of dollars in jobs that people that we have to hire and, work with the local communities in order to build those facilities. They're not easily reversed, right? So we have to have a lot of data, as much data as we possibly can get. Jeff Bezos says like 90% of the available data that you can possibly get in order to make a decision like that. But oftentimes decisions aren't one-way doors. They are reversible, and we call those two-way door decisions. We try to make as many two-way door decisions as possible, right? So I told you a minute ago that my team is constantly like evaluating decisions with our customers and changing the types of technology and tools that we're using in order to help them succeed. And those are all two-way door decisions, right? In those cases, we don't wait until we have all the information, right? You get as much information as you can, but at some point, the cost of waiting is actually more than the cost of going ahead and experimenting. And I actually think this point is very difficult for companies that have been around for a long time, that have very low risk tolerance. And I see this in AWS all the time. I know a lot of my examples are AWS specific. So if you're not into, the industry, I'll have to excuse me, but I see customers that are used to spending like upfront significant capital investments in order to build competencies. Say networking is a good example, right? If you were to build your corporate network around a very specific, you have to make like very specific technology decisions that require multi-year, multi-million-dollar commitments. You have to hire teams of specialists that understand that commitment. You have to do vendor contracts that are very expensive. So it makes sense for you to do a lot of due diligence up front. And even if it takes months or years, it's probably worth it because of your investment. But with AWS, that same situation, you can build and iterate through your corporate network at zero cost, right? Like spinning up a new network on AWS is zero cost for you. So it's now a two-way door decision, right? You can go ahead, experiment, see how it works, throw away the stuff that doesn't work and double down on the stuff that does, right? So I do think a lot of companies struggle to differentiate between one and two-way door decisions. And oftentimes you wait too long to try something that in fact is a reversible decision if it doesn't go well. This is something you have to be super sensitive of if it's visible to your customers, right? Earn trust is an Amazon leadership principle. And you don't want to lose trust with your customers by representing a product to them and not following through on it. So we're definitely sensitive to that. So that's the Amazon culture pillar, and there'll be more kind of cultural elements kind of integrated into the other three things we talk about. The next is mechanisms, which is mechanism is a very specific word at Amazon, but it's really a complete process that turns, an input into an output using like a repeatable process. And it's an encoded behavior that enforces kind of like the innovative thinking that we want. So Jeff's got a pretty famous talk at Amazon on mechanisms. And the example that he uses is he was sitting with a customer service on a customer service line one time. And a lady called in and she was having difficulty with the piece of furniture she had received. It was damaged. And the associate that he was sitting next to said, "Oh, I know this piece of furniture. This always happens with this piece of furniture. You're going to have to refund her." And Jeff said, "Wait a second. What do you mean this always happens with this piece of furniture?" And she said, Yeah. This piece of furniture, there's something about the way it's handled in the shipping process. It always gets damaged. So we see this all the time." And Jeff was floored, right? Like how do we have a consistent negative customer experience? It's costing us money. It's a negative for the customer. Like this can't possibly work, right? So what he's found over time, and his point of this is that normally you would go to the team and you'd say, hey, this needs to be better, right? I'm the CEO of the company. This isn't the way I expect our customers to be experiencing this, and this must be costing us money, right? But what he realized over time is that essentially you're asking your organization and your team members for good intentions, right? And good intentions don't work, right? Like I do this with my team all the time. I'm like, hey, you should try better, right? Like you should be better at this. And to ask for good intentions at some level, especially in a big company, it just gets lost, right? Because every day there's new operational things that you have to focus on. There's new things popping up all the time. Asking for good intentions is not like a scalable way to enforce best practices in an organization. So what we prefer are mechanisms. So in this case, as an example of a mechanism, they built out the andon cord system, which is borrowed from Japanese manufacturing, where a customer service agent can automatically identify like a continuous problem with a product on Amazon.com, and they can hit the andon cord, which immediately pulls that product from the website. And we've implemented this same concept kind of throughout Amazon, right? And we've automated it in many ways. So we don't even have to wait for a customer service representative to identify something's wrong. So that's the mechanism in order to make sure that we're not having consistently poor customer experiences when things are wrong, right? And then in this case, we have a dedicated team who reviews those problems and then works through the process in order to make sure we resolve it and we get it back online. So we've got mechanisms throughout Amazon that enforce behaviors that are best practices or that we want it to be encoded into the DNA of the company. So in the context of innovation, the mechanism that we use is what we call the PR FAQ, right? Press release, frequently asked questions, documents, right? And so this is the way we work backwards from a customer problem to a proposed solution. So like I said in the beginning, oftentimes companies will build something and then kind of toss it over the wall to marketing and sales and say, hey, now this is ready to be sold. We think it should be the other way around. Write the press release that outlines the customer problem and who the customer is, what you're doing, and how you're going to be solving it for them. And then once the scope of what you're doing is super clear and the value added for your customer is super clear, then you begin building, right? And the advantage of this from a builder perspective is that you now have this like super clear document on what you're building that you can refer back to during that building process. So, the most important questions to ask in the very beginning are, who are the customers, right? What are their needs? Where do they have pain or frustration in their life? What time of day is it? Is it emotional versus functional? Like there's all this context that you need to get around your customer in addition to just the standard problem in order to really be able to deliver for them. And, back when we were in the office, people had we had lanyards, and this was a common kind of card on a lanyard, right? And these are the questions that you ask when you're working backwards from a problem. Who's the customer? What's the problem or opportunity? What's the benefit to the customer? And is it clear? Do we know what the customers need or want? And then what does the customer experience look like, right? So this is something that Amazon employees had on their lanyards for a long time. The press release, like I said, is the first part of this process. So the press release is very much a press release that you would see released by any company. And in fact, a really simple way to see how we do this is just to go look at Amazon press releases, right? I promise you that the press releases that you see when we release a new product are very, very similar to the press release that was written internally by the team either months or years ago when they first started working on the product. And the press release includes like fake quotes from potential customers, right? Like, how do we want customers to react to this, right? What do we want people saying about the product? Who are the customers, right? So, and there's an example in the next slide where you can see a little bit about how we write and the wording, because writing style at Amazon is also very particular. So writing style in the press release document, it needs to be super clear. You can see on the left side is what you might see in like a corporate vision document. On the right side is like the way we would write that at Amazon. So it's very oriented around the customer, plain language, not a lot of Amazon internal terms, right? Like you're thinking it's a press release, so it needs to be oriented as if it's being read by the outside world. We even do this when we're building internal services. So this isn't just something that we do when we're building something that's going to be viewed by our customers or clients. If we're building something for another internal team, we'll write a press release. And I can tell you our product people and even engineers write many press releases a year, and some don't see the light of day, right? Sometimes it's a exercise in evaluating what we possibly could build for a customer. And then you surface it up through your team and you discuss it, and you decide that you should really implement it as a feature in something else, or it's not a priority. But the exercise of going through it helps orient you around what the customer's problem is, and it drives that working backwards mentality. The next is the FAQ, right? So frequently asked questions. It's like those questions that come up after you've read the press release, right? So some of these questions are internal only questions, especially when you're circulating the document around your team and your managers and all the way up the decision chain. Some of these are like the hard questions somebody would ask about the service internally. And then the other ones, like you can see here, are things that could very easily end up being in the FAQ section of the customer facing product. And a great example of this, just like the press releases, all the AWS services, if you go to aws.amazon.com and you look at our services, they all have FAQ sections. And I promise you, the FAQ sections in the original product design were very similar to the ones that you're seeing on the public website. So it's a great example of kind of seeing our design process work itself out in a very public way. But we try to answer as many of the sticky questions within the FAQ as possible. And you'll still see that the FAQ section, the examples here, we're not talking about specific technologies, right? We're not talking about specific internal systems that we might have to integrate with. That's still too specific and too much of an implementation detail for the PR FAQ process. And this comes down to, and this is hard for me as a technology person, I can't help but think about all the challenges that lay in front of me when I look at an idea. But the Amazon process really tries to reinforce that, hey, when we're trying to find a vision for what we should build for a customer, it's not the customer's responsibility to drive what the technical implementation details should be, right? That's our job to figure it out after the fact. And this stage is really to focus squarely on where do we need to be providing value. And like I said, it's hard for me as a technology person to get that out of my mind, and I've tried to adapt to that over time.
Hey, Andrew, two quick questions that came in. One is around the differentiation between customer and user. I know, are the terms different in your head? I know you've used multiple. And then Scott had a great question too. So the differences between AWS and Amazon, cultural differences. So can you just touch on those two real quick?
Yeah. So we use the word customer really across it very generically at Amazon. It stands for really whoever you're serving, right? So in my capacity right now, definitely customers are AWS customers, specifically within financial services. There are teams within Amazon that deliver services internally, right? So as a manager, I get to use our HR tools, and our HR teams have like developers that write HR software just for Amazon employees and managers to use. So in those cases, I'm the customer of our HR team, right? So I'd say customer and user, is very synonymous in this example, or in the examples that I'm giving. In your business, you might call them clients. But I think that's another an important thing to remember too, is even if you're not in a job where you're specifically customer facing, I think first taking the team that you're delivering to as your internal customer is important, and considering their context. Like, for example, when we build an internal service, oftentimes the team that builds that internal service takes a really good care to have really good documentation and tools and make the onboarding of that service really easy for people, right? Because their other internal teams within Amazon are their customers. And then the second question was around culture differences between AWS and Amazon.com. I'm not an expert in that because I've worked in AWS since I've gotten here. I've worked on some climate projects with Amazon team. I would say the leadership principles are universally applied. Everything that we're talking about here today is very universal across AWS and Amazon. I'm confident there's other, cultural differences, but everything we're talking about today really is universally applied. A lot of the leaders in AWS were part of Amazon before AWS existed. So that drives a lot of culture. Andy Jassy, as you all know, is going to be the new CEO of Amazon. He's been he's been at Amazon 24 years, and he's been the AWS CEO for the last, since we started, right? So having leaders that have spanned both organizations drives a lot of cultural consistency. And the leadership principles govern both both sides. And we use the same tools and hiring processes. And then where it makes sense for AWS to do things differently, we do, right? Like offering enterprise software services is much different than operating an e-commerce website. But so our customers look different and our value proposition looks different, but a lot of the cultural and the team organization aspects are actually remarkably similar. So this is an example of a visual, right? So I think a lot of innovation process do these, right? I don't think this is unique to us at all, but it's important sometimes when you're trying to describe a new product or offering to just offer like simple visual elements that help explain what you want to build, especially when you're trying to be aggressive and you're innovative, thinking big.
Andrew, quick question. I know there's a lot of questions are coming through, so I want to make sure there's a little bit of a theme. The costliest or the costly experiments that you mentioned, which failed, any example of that? And tied into a little bit of that is some of the, does it always have to be performative, right? Is there learning outcomes? And that's one of the questions from the group as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think and this is a really good point that's later on the deck, but we can talk about it now, is innovation and failure are twins that you cannot separate, right? Like you can't have one without the other. If you're unwilling to tolerate failure, you're not going to be able to experience significant innovation. And you learn from failure, right? Like I think if you treat failure as a learning experience instead of like a reflection on somebody's individual performance, then it's super beneficial to the company. And the example later on in the slide, but I'll talk about it now, is Amazon Fire Phone, right? Like we did an awful job at the Amazon Fire Phone, but the same team that built the Fire Phone went on to build Alexa, right? So they used a bunch of the components of technology and skills that they had built during the Fire Phone and a bunch of the cool features and feedback that they did receive, and totally turned that around and made what is like one of our largest, investment in business areas right now. So innovation and failure are not something that you can separate, and you have to tolerate it. Definitely, I think there's always a balance here, right? Of making sure that you're innovating in a way that is intentional and that you're learning in a way that's intentional, right? There's always a return on investment that businesses have to consider. But if you're doing, we focus on inputs and outputs a lot. If you're putting all the right inputs in, then the outputs are less important. And we really focus on that, right? If the team is really focusing on customer needs and wants, and we're learning a lot from the customer experience, then failure is okay. Great. I got one more point here, and then we can go on to the next section. So the really interesting thing about Amazon culture is with these documents, when you come to a meeting and we're going to talk about one of these documents, we actually spend the first 20 minutes of the meeting reading the document, and then we get into a discussion. So we definitely like long form. We don't really use PowerPoint internally. Jeff has a kind of early in Amazon's history, was evidently somebody was giving him a PowerPoint presentation, and he was like, hey, I don't have enough information to like make a decision here. Why don't you hand me the notes from your presentation, right? So the person gave him all the notes, and it was all his long form data and explanations. And he said, this is great. Let's just bring this next time. So that's kind of like the story of how we shifted from like a PowerPoint culture to a long form written culture. And it's great because in a PowerPoint slide, it's very easy to put like a bullet point that represents something much deeper, but to not have enough time or space to really evaluate, to like elaborate on it. But when you write something long form, you're actually like forced to fully explain and to back up your reasoning for that idea, right? So you could see like an example of on a PowerPoint slide for a new idea, you would send to your management team saying, bullet point, need a mobile app, right? But at Amazon, you couldn't ever just write need a mobile app as an entire paragraph. You'd have to explain why it has to be a mobile app, the research that you've done, the data on the customer experience that you maybe pulled from other areas, right? You have to fully explain why that's a good investment and why you made that decision. So long form is super important to our communication process in Amazon, and we're writing all the time. It's kind of insane.
How does that? Well, we're probably gonna ask the same question. Came in from with so much of the focus being on digital and UI UX being so important. How does that translate or be accommodated by the long form written narrative?
Digital UI.
Yeah, like changes in design, or are you conveying more of the value that's trying to be created, how digital augments that, or how do you talk through potential changes in the UI UX?
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're for like web developers and UI designers, I definitely think like incremental changes in the user interface is not something that we write long form documents for, right? Long form documents are for like significant new features and products that you might release. So for example, we've changed our AWS UI platform over the last couple of years to be much more of a platform that various AWS teams can pick up and use very easily. And so the development of taking the initial kind of piecemeal system and building it into a full like scalable platform that people could use, that's something that would require like significant analysis, long form narrative, write out, but something that's extremely, iterative, like a simple, component change, like probably doesn't require a 6-page narrative, which is kind of the default length is 6 pages. We do a lot of like small press release PR FAQs, even if it's not a significant change, if it feels like it's going to be, if your conviction for that change comes from a customer experience pain that you see, it's worth writing it out in a way that is going to convey that, especially if it's going to require investment from other people, right? If it's just you or 1 or 2 people on your team that can make that change, maybe writing a PR FAQ is a bit redundant, but almost always when it's a bigger change or a bigger feature, we write it out in long form and include visuals, right? Include visuals. It's great. So we're going to go into, just for a minute here, tech, right? So, Amazon really led or was one of the leaders when it came to separating our services and microservices. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, right? Like I think everybody's kind of tired to hear about microservices and they understand what they are, but it's super important for Amazon that we separated our services and components into small individual pieces that we can replace and iterate on without being tied to other teams. And you'll see that in a second. Also, self-service platforms are huge within Amazon, right? So like I said, if you're an internal team and you're building something and your customer is other internal teams, we want it to be self-service, right? We don't want to have gatekeepers. How many times in your organization when you want to do something, you have to go talk to like 15 different people in order to get it done? We try to avoid that. I'm not saying that doesn't happen at Amazon, but we try to make things self-service. So if you want to build a new service within Amazon, you don't really need to talk to anybody. There's just a bunch of tools that our security teams released, that our platform teams released, that our CI/CD teams have released, where you can just pick up their tooling and get started. And then, I think this is like the natural kind of benefit of the microservices movement of having tools that people can pick up and use without a lot of dependencies. And we really try to like ruthlessly remove dependencies from our technology, but also from our team organizations, right? So allow people to be able to move quickly, and not have, not have to wait on other teams, and really be able to control their own destiny. So I've just got a couple more slides here, and then I'll try to take one question at the end. So, but organization, right? How do we organize teams? So first, we really focus on hiring builders, right? So we have a huge builder culture. We want people coming here that are going to be builders and enjoy creating something for our customers. We always say we want to be the best place for builders to build. And that doesn't necessarily have to just be technologists, right? I think there's people that can build processes, teams, systems. There's a lot of different ways to be a builder. Certainly, engineering and technology is a huge builder focus for us, but it doesn't have to just be that way. But we want to be a great place for builders to build. 2 pizza teams. So the idea of it is none of our teams should be bigger than what you can feed with 2 pizzas, which is kind of just like metaphorical. Really, it's 6 to 12 people generally, but the idea here is that your team owns something that you build and operate it, which blew my mind when I came to Amazon. Our engineering teams, not only do they build their service, they don't kick it over a fence and then let an operations team operate it. They actually operate it as well, which is a great mechanism. It's probably a whole different talk on how that's a feedback loop of operations back into the development process. Has been such a powerful thing for us. But we try to give our teams a lot of ownership, right? They should be able to own their product, how they're adding value to their customer, either internal or external, and then the technology decisions as well. They're able to own that, and not have as many dependencies on external teams. And these teams are, we hire who we need on these teams in order to get the job done. Like I said, it starts with the customer, right? So if we're building new UI features, we actually need a lot more web developers on this team, and possibly only a couple back-end developers. But if we're building a Kindle, we need hardware engineers, right? It's all going to flow back from what we need in order to get the job done for the customer. Experimentation, I've talked about that, right? Like experimentation constantly. Most experiments are 2-way doors. And then I talked about this, right? Failure and innovation are just twins that you can't separate. And you have to be willing to learn and iterate on the failures in order to see the big wins. And we talked about the Fire Phone. So from there, I got a minute or two. I'll just leave it on this last slide and take any questions.